Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
All right, Bri. So a couple weeks ago, I threw a little bit of shade at Stoicism. Even though I like it, I kind of threw a little bit of shade of the over-enthusiasms around Stoicism. And I figured to make up for that we'd start today's podcast with a Stoic quote.
All the Stoics, thank you.
Okay.
They feel vindicated.
Yeah, no, they don't feel anything, actually.
Well said. Okay, so the Stoic philosopher Epictetus said that no man is free who is not master of himself. And no man can master himself without mastery of his own brain and mind. So I have a question for you. What tools and practices are you intentionally employing on a consistent basis to develop mastery of your mind? Now, to help you answer that question, we're going to be diving deep into one specific superpower of the brain, neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change, reorganize, and grow over time. But for that growth and that change to happen on your terms, you have to play an integral role. And to help teach you how to play that role masterfully, we have Ben Ahrens, co-founder of Rewiring, an online brain training program to help people reclaim their health by rewiring their brain. Now, in fact, Rewiring is the program that I've been using to rewire my brain as I've been healing from Lyme disease, which is a chronic illness that Ben Ahrens knows even more intimately than I, because he spent 3 years bedridden with Lyme disease, his body in a constant state of hypervigilant fight or flight response. And the only way that he could make his way back to full health was to reclaim authority over a brain that had been hijacked by fear. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to train the brain to take the threat response and instead to experience those as challenges. Ben's going to share how neuroplasticity training is different from meditation. He's going to go over the neurobiology of flow state, that place of peak performance, how to sustain motivation without burning out, and we're going to finish up with some exercises that you can do to develop mastery over your brain. Welcome to the show, Ben Ahrens.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. I'm thrilled to be here.
We're pumped to have you here, Ben, man. And I got to thank you so much because you are the man who helped me find the New York Center for Innovative Medicine, which is where I've been getting my treatments because that was the place that helped you find your health. And I've been going through your Rewiring online neuroplasticity course, which is helping me to retrain my brain from being in that hypervigilant state of fight or flight and to reclaim authority over my own health by rewiring my brain. So I thought that we might start with the birthplace of Rewiring and why that was so important to you, because you spent 3 years bedridden, debilitated by an illness that you didn't even know what it was for a period of time. Is that true?
Yeah, exactly. So, it was really an outgrowth of my own personal experience. And even prior to that, just passion for health and fitness and what the human being is capable of. As a young teenager, I remember getting into exercise and just was fascinated by this concept that you could go from having an idea in your head, like I'm going to get stronger, and then you could learn a series of actual things to do, like exercise, that would actually change the way your body feels, performs, and functions and looks. So in my mid-20s, I was working in the fitness industry. I had probably what was the most embarrassing thing happen that could happen to anyone working in that field and trying to portray themselves as this healthy person. Like you mentioned, I got completely sick, ended up bedbound for 3 years with what turned out to be a chronic neurologic Lyme infection. And en route to that discovery of what it was, I was diagnosed with things like MS and chronic fatigue syndrome, which is really just a descriptive term, of course, dysautonomia, and a wide range of other things. Had some very scary test results come back showing multiple brain lesions in the frontal cortex. I had bone-on-bone arthritis in the knees. So things were happening in the body, physical changes, structural changes, and cognitive changes that were said to be irreversible. I gave a TED Talk in 2015 where I described the real experience of looking at these spots on the wall one morning and not knowing what they were, and then realizing that they were my shoes, but still not understanding how to use them or what they were for. So these were the kinds of things. This was the kind of state that I found myself in for years while trying to understand how I would get out of this. And that led me down the rabbit hole of first conventional medicine and antibiotics, and then eventually biological medicine, which gave me this foundational understanding that the body is actually a self-healing system. And the process of healing turns out to be much more about setting the stage. That's to say, setting the right conditions for the body to do what it naturally does, which is to self-heal, as opposed to the doctor making the healing happen or us making the healing happen. So that led me down the route of biological medicine, various treatments there, and then going a little bit deeper into this notion of the brain and starting to understand that one of the things that can keep us stuck whenever we're experiencing a state of chronic illness or anxiety or stress or ongoing symptoms is that the brain has an incredible ability to learn. And it does this really for two reasons. The brain's two primary functions are, number one, to keep you safe, and number two, to be as efficient as possible. And it does that by, to the first part, preferentially sending its attention or its awareness to things that are potential threats. And then number two, consolidating those in memories, meaning consolidating that in terms of how your body should respond. Here we can get a little bit into neuroplasticity, but just to sum up my story, after about 3 or 4 years of trying to figure this out, and then an additional, say, 18 months of treatment with biological medicine, and then getting into this brain retraining to really retrain how my body and brain had learned to respond to things like the environment. I had sensitivities to light and sound and food and chemicals and Wi-Fi. Also, it had learned to respond to the symptoms themselves. And like you said, it kept me stuck in this hypervigilant state. Where I started to become really hopeful is when I started to learn this concept of neuroplasticity, which is basically, like you noted, the brain's ability to change itself. But there's something called self-directed neuroplasticity, which is used in things like neurocognitive rehab, for stroke victims. And this is the ability that we all have to actually be the author of what direction that change goes into. So again, just like when I was, a teenager and learned how to work out to change my body, I realized that there was actually things that you could do very deliberately, exercises to retrain your brain and nervous system that would ultimately lead to a total transformation of how your body, how your physiology responds to stress, to illness, to anxiety, and even how your immune system functions. So after about, I'd say 8 to 10 months of really digging in and practicing these exercises, I was able to come back from being bedbound 3 years to full-time work. Still, had a lot of recovery to do over the next subsequent years, but something had radically changed. Every symptom, every ache or pain, every problem that I perceived I had, I was now facing it as a new opportunity to practice more of this brain retraining and getting stronger all along the way. So that led me to ultimately putting these pieces together and starting the Reorigin program so that others with similar conditions could sort of follow in those same footsteps.
That's awesome, Ben. And what makes you such a credible authority around brain training is different than a lot of other experts I've heard talk about brain training and brain optimization, is that you come from a place of like having been at the bottom. Things were broken. Life was kind of hanging in the balance. You were, like you just said, you saw shoes. You couldn't even name what they were. And then you didn't even know what the function was. And then you built yourself all the way back to becoming a CEO of a business, and you have multiple businesses and fully back to health. So I think it's really powerful to be able to learn from you. Just to give our listeners context for today, what we're really talking about is getting into some of the practicalities of your everyday life, right? Because many of our listeners don't have chronic illnesses, but they do have chronic stress, maybe chronic self-doubt, that feeling of anxiety, that undercurrent that's just always there. And so it may be really helpful to start in this place that you had referenced earlier about the threat response, right? The brain's two functions are to keep you safe and to be as efficient as possible. That safety thing, it can go too far sometimes, can it? And what happens when it does?
Yeah. So, I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with the concept of like the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, or this fight or flight response. What happens is, the brain is taking in an incredible amount of information, about 11 million bits of information per second, which is far too much for the brain to process. So what it does is through a network in the brain called the salience network. It's the same network that allows us to focus in on, say, a conversation with one person in a crowded, noisy room, is that it zooms in, or it preferentially tries to pull out the signal through the noise. Now, because the brain has evolved to, number one, keep you safe, it has what's known a negativity bias. That simply means that it will often preferentially focus on the things that it perceives are potential threats. And again, I use two words here that are kind of key: perception and potential. Because nothing in this day and age, well, I won't say nothing, but most of the things that cause us stress are not inherently life-threatening, right? So the things that we stress about, an argument with our spouse, a difficult conversation with a coworker or employee, something like, anticipating a negative conversation or outcome. These are things that unpleasant, sure. Like, do we prefer them? No, we don't prefer them. But life-threatening? Absolutely not. The problem is that the brain, when it comes to these things, basically has only two categories. It doesn't have the full spectrum. The two categories are threatening or non-threatening. And if in the past we've learned that something is dangerous or threatening or gives us that overwhelming feeling of discomfort or agitation, the brain will have learned from the past in order to protect us in the future. And so the next time we encounter that thing, and it doesn't even have to be the thing itself, it can even be an anticipation of the thing. The next time we encounter having that conversation with that person, or encounter going on stage and giving a talk, the brain will actually summon up all of that past programming and revert the physical body, that's to say, change our chemistry in real time to mimic that type of response as if we're in that threat. So there's kind of a lot going on here, but to distill it down, the basic concept is the brain has in some way misinterpreted these challenges, or these obstacles, we could say, as actual threats, and the body responds accordingly. And that bodily response that we feel is what we know as things like anxiety or overwhelm. And if this is left ongoing, will lead to depression, burnout, depletion of key metabolites in the brain that make it very difficult, if not impossible, to feel at ease and hopeful for the future.
Ben, really quick, tie this back for me. So you said there were a lot of problems that you had in the past that manifested in a physical way that put you in bed for 3 years, one of which sounds like was Lyme disease. But now we're moving into neuroplasticity and looking at what are actual threats versus what are just experiences from our past that are dredged back up. So just take me back really quick. How is this piece of it, the threat perception, tied to the physical manifestation experience that you had?
Yeah. So whenever someone finds themselves in, I'll call it an extreme state, this can be physical symptoms, this can be mental or emotional symptoms, overwhelm, anxiety. There's a confluence of different factors that are going on. Probably your listeners have read the book Anti-Fragile, basically the notion that as human beings, we have this incredibly unique ability to actually not only be resilient, but gain from disorder. So an example he gives is if you drop a glass plate on the floor and it breaks, well, that's fragile. If you drop a plastic plate and it doesn't break, we know that that's resilient. But imagine if you had a plate where you drop it on the floor and it actually becomes stronger as a result of dropping it. This is very much in line with the human being. We have an unbelievable ability to handle crazy amounts of stress and emotions and pathogens and toxins and all of these things, but we are also finite in some way. And if or when all of those stressors, what's called an allostatic stress load, builds up to a point where it exceeds our ability to recover from it in a given time period, it will overwhelm the central nervous system. This sends the brain on high alert. And when the brain is in that state of high alert, it's hyper motivated to learn, right? Because it's like the threat detection mechanism, area of the brain called the limbic system, is basically now looking for threats, looking for problems that it thinks it needs to solve. And like a hammer looking for nails, when it looks, it will find them. And it will find them in places that are often, again, not life-threatening, not necessarily worthy of such a visceral threat response.
I'm laughing because I can totally relate to this right now because my system is all jacked up, right? And it's in this chronic state of fight or flight. And I live in New York City. I love New York City. One of my favorite things to do in New York City is to walk around the city, take in all the sights, the sounds, the smells. I mean, it's crazy. It's usually a circus here. Over these last few months, walking around New York City has been a frightening experience for me. There's always a horn that's honking. There's a garbage truck. Those things freak out my nervous system. And as I'm walking down the street, I feel like I'm in, I don't know if you guys ever saw those movies like Final Destination.
Oh yeah.
Where you know what I'm talking about? Where there's these really unlikely scenarios where people die. For example, I'll walk underneath like a fire escape ladder and I'm worried that it's going to like come down and impale me in the eye. Or across the street and I'm like walking over a manhole cover and I'm afraid that it's going to explode. It's strange, like these weird, like everything is a threat right now. And Ben, one of the things that you taught me in the Reorigin program is this, like the limbic system hijack, right? This loop. So can we talk about the loop? And while we talk about the loop, let's make it tangible to our listeners who don't have Lyme disease, who aren't worried about a fire escape hitting them in the head, but maybe something more like an email comes through from an angry customer, or they forgot to do the thing they promised their wife to do. And then now they're about to have to pay the penance for that. Like those real life examples of the limbic system getting in action. What does that look like?
Yeah. So first of all, it can totally relate to the New York experience. I had the same experience when I came back from, or was recovering from the Lyme, just being bombarded and overwhelmed by all these sights and sounds and heightened sensitivities. And the important thing to note there's this, like I said, the limbic system is the brain's threat detection and response mechanism. So it has those two functions. Stimuli come in, we'll call them benign stimuli, because something like a loud sound is not inherently good or bad or threatening or non-threatening. It's just a sound. But the limbic system's job is to interpret that. And then based on its interpretation, which is based on past experience or that elevated level of agitation, it will determine what it thinks is the appropriate response in the body. If you're in that elevated state, that will be the mobilization of these so-called stress hormones and chemicals, things like cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine that make us feel agitated, anxious, and basically not good. So let's use the first example you gave to kind of tangify this. We'll call it emails coming through or something, right? So, and how these sort of limbic system loops work. Well, let's say, in the past, maybe when a person or when you were under a lot of stress, we all go through periods of stress, at work. And maybe there were times where there was angry emails coming through or problems that were difficult to solve. The brain is always making associations. That's basically how it learns. And this is a core tenet of neuroplasticity. Donald Hebb said that neurons that fire together wire together. So basically, it's like coupling, an event with a certain visceral experience. So let's say there was a day, for example, where you were feeling particularly agitated or overwhelmed or anxious. And then, you got an email from a customer that was like, this customer is going to leave. This is going to like ruin half my business, whatever it might be. It was a big deal. In that instance, the brain forms this neurological association between the event, in this case, the angry customer email, and the bodily response. Now, keep in mind, you might have already been stressed or underslept or something, but because you were in that state in the time when you got this email, now your brain has coupled these two things together. In the future, let's say, now, okay, things kind of come back to baseline, but let's say 6 months later, a similar type of email or something comes through. Now, all of a sudden, it triggers that same response in the body that your brain has learned and prepared to deploy in an effort to protect you from this threatening event. Obviously, in this case, it's not really protection. It's actually immobilizing you and making it difficult for you to solve the problem. I can give an example, actually, how I used this and used neuroplasticity to recondition myself from it, just to kind of like put it in a framework. One of the things that I noticed when I got back to full-time work, and I worked in an office in Times Square. So for someone overcoming, sensitivities to light and sound and everything, it was a challenge to say the least. So by the time I got to my office, I was already like heart rate racing and everything. And I worked in a sales position. So my phone was ringing about 30 or 40 times a day. One of the things that I realized is that when the phone rang, I would get this immediate panic attack almost. I would notice my heart rate increase and pupils dilate and sweat come to my palms and everything. I started to realize that, maybe my brain has made an association in some way between that ringing phone, that sound, and this threat response. And then, of course, my conscious mind would chime in and I would start to stir up or spin up these stories of a customer service issue I wouldn't be able to handle, or something that needed to be returned, or I did something wrong, or whatever it might be. All of this would go on in my head in a microsecond, and I'd pick up the phone in that panic state. And obviously I would underserve the person on the other end because I wasn't in an optimal state. Once I became aware that this was going on, I made a simple practice for myself. And I had, already started studying neuroplasticity and brain training exercises. So I was like, okay, it's worked in other areas of my life. Let's see if I can use it in this scenario as well. And all I did was I made a simple rule for myself. First, I wrote down, okay, phone rings, that's the trigger. What happens in my body? Okay, I have these agitating feelings and thoughts. And then how do I behave? I shrink down in my seat. I don't really show up well. So I kind of had that loop mapped out. Then I was like, okay, well, how do I want this to go instead? What would be more advantageous to my work and overall experience? So, so phone rings. Now it would be great to be able to feel calm, to feel at ease, to feel confident. And then the behavior that would follow from that is to pick up the phone with confidence, knowing that I can solve the problem. If it even is a problem, most of the time it's not. Again, it's, the key here is that the brain and body don't just respond to what's happening. They respond to what you anticipate will happen. This is called anticipatory secretion of chemicals. Once I had that rule set for myself, okay, now when the phone rings, I'm going to push myself back from my desk. I'm going to put a smile on my face. I'm going to take a deep breath, maybe even visualize for just a second, having a pleasant conversation with the person. And then I'm going to pick up the phone. And so I started to put this into practice, and I failed at it, half the time or most of the times, but I started to get it right more and more. And every time the phone rang, it now became an opportunity to practice this new response. It was like this challenge instead of like this threat. And each time I practiced, at first it was really, really hard, but after about 2 weeks, something magical happened. One day I remember this distinctly, that the phone rang in my office, and all of a sudden, a smile came to my face. My shoulders dropped back. I started to take deep breaths. I relaxed. I got excited to answer the phone, and I did, and had a pleasant conversation.
It's like Pavlov's dog, like salivating, right? I mean, it's the same kind of principle.
Exactly the same principle. This is, in fact, known as Pavlovian conditioning. And the same way that the brain gets conditioned to perceive something as a threat and act accordingly, we can use that same exact science, basically, to condition it or retrain it in a way that's more advantageous for how we want to show up. So I realized in that magic moment that ringing phone had transformed from a trigger for stress and panic and anxiety into basically a trigger for relaxation. And I was like, okay, well, what else is triggering me? What other thoughts or emotions or people or conversations or anything, can I apply this to? And so you can imagine, if you have these things that are happening in your life, on a day-to-day basis, let's say many of us might have like 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 of these things, these little things that are triggering us that we're not even aware of. But once you start to become aware of them and then implement a process like this, or start to retrain them one by one, what you find is that cognitive bandwidth comes back to you. We spend an exorbitant amount of brain energy and physical or chemical energy being in that stress state. And so if you undo the basis of these triggers through rewiring the threat response, you actually start to get a lot more energy back, enthusiasm comes back, motivation comes back. And the cool thing is that once you start to go down this road, you don't have to do this for each and every little tiny trigger or stressor that you've ever had in your life. You do it for enough of the major ones, and it's like a Jenga tower. You pull out the key pieces along the base, and then the whole belief system will collapse.
Ben, you mentioned in the beginning of this podcast that you can become the author of how your brain works, and you just gave us a great example of that. And I'm curious, is that neuroplasticity? What exactly are you doing to your brain when you're giving yourself those prompts?
Yeah. So one of the best ways to think about neuroplasticity is by analogy. Let's say you have, trucks that are driving onto the beach, and the first truck goes down the beach and it drives, let's say, makes a left-hand turn and leaves a set of tracks in the sand. Now, whenever we have a certain behavior or feeling or response, it creates basically grooves in the brain. These are new neuronal connections that form together. And the more we go down that road, the more we sort of practice, whether it's consciously or unwittingly, practice that behavior, that habit or response, the more we strengthen that. So let's say, a second truck goes down the beach, makes that left-hand turn and follows in those same tracks. The more trucks drive onto the beach, the easier it is for them to just go in the same tracks because it's already sort of plowing the way. It's just making it easier. And the brain does the exact same thing. This is the tenet that neurons that fire together, wired together and become more efficient. Now, let's say these trucks are going down the beach and then you kind of realize you're coming up to this path. You see, there's all these tracks there. It's way easier to just go that way. But that's actually not the way I want to go. That's not really going to get me to where I want to be. Where I want to go is I want to go right. Now, you start driving and you're in those tracks. So to get out of the tracks initially, you have to use a little bit more energy. And the way we do this in neuroplasticity, it actually takes excess chemical energy. This is why it's so hard to break a habit, because on a physical, structural level, you are breaking apart old neurons that have been covered together under a myelin sheath to make them more efficient. And you are saying, okay, we're not going to go down that road anymore. We're going to forge a new path. We're going to go a new way. And so you could imagine that first truck that has to jump over that hump, it's a big deal. He's got to put it into four-wheel drive and really gun it to get over the hurdle. Maybe the next one that does it, a little bit less energy. The next one, a little bit less. But eventually you can see that those new tracks begin to form and it becomes easier to go down that new road, that new habit, that new response, that new way of being. And eventually the old tracks will erode and not even exist anymore. So at that point, it becomes really interesting because on an experiential level, once we've really rewired our brains, especially with something like the threat response, which is such a visceral feeling, and those old tracks have been covered, the interesting thing that happens to a lot of people is they're like, I remember that this thing used to stress me out, but I can't remember why. I can't remember even what that felt like. You essentially feel like a different person.
That's a super helpful example. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Is neuroplasticity something that we have that's genetic? Is it something to do with age? Is it something like how much control do we actually have over this thing called neuroplasticity?
Yeah. So when we talk about neuroplasticity in general, neuroplasticity is basically just the brain's ability to change its structure and its function. And it does this through a process called neurogenesis, which, as the name implies, is like the creation of new neurons or brain cells. And this is really in and of itself significant because up until the maybe early 90s, it was thought that the brain was static and after a certain age would stop growing, stop changing, and that brain cells would just die. And once this discovery was made, thanks in part to the advent of technologies like fMRIs, they realized that the brain never stops changing. From the day we're born until the day we die, we have this raw potential to change the way our brain functions, which in turn can change the way our body reacts to things. So neuroplasticity is just this general sort of raw potential. Now, what we do in Reorigin is kind of more what we're talking about here, which is that self-directed neuroplasticity. That means taking ownership or responsibility or being the author of which direction that change occurs into. Again, because of the brain's evolved negativity bias, more often than not, I would say neuroplasticity is actually working against us. It's actually, leading us down this road of misclassifying things as threats. And here's something that's really key. Every time we respond to something as if it's a threat. So let's go back to that email example. Now you get emails from customers and let's say you feel that little threat response or that anxiety or, in the pit of your stomach. And let's say instead of answering the email right away, you avoid the discomfort. You check Facebook, you check social media, you get up, you walk around, you do something else, right? What's happening there is we're actually subconsciously reinforcing that pattern. Even though it's not our intention, our intention is simply to get out of the uncomfortable feeling. But by avoiding it, we are sort of lending it credence. We're saying, oh, it was right to give me that signal, And we're sort of confirming it and strengthening those old neural pathways that we actually want to break. So yeah, neuroplasticity is often happening in those two directions. But once we become aware of this and we start consciously implementing these types of tools, now we're in a place of power. Now we are the authors of our own experience.
Yeah, Bri, what it sounds like the science underneath drifting, this is the term that we use all the time here, is the number one enemy to living an intentional life is this state of drift, which is when you're just on autopilot.
That's it. Where
unconscious habits and patterns and belief systems are taking you in a certain direction. And what you're describing here with the brain is wired, like you said, to try and protect you and to be as efficient as possible. And that can work against you when you're not behind the wheel. And also, like you said, it requires a lot of energy because you have to rip away old chemical processes, lay new track. And I think this could be a really interesting point for us to talk about the differences between meditation and neuroplasticity because, throughout the process of healing, meditation has always been like a great go-to for me. It has been a real challenge while I've had this chronic illness where it's just screaming. My insides are screaming. Physically, it's loud. It feels terrible. Mentally, the chatter is berserk and bananas. And the analogy, the way that you were giving to Brian about the tracks in the sand, what meditation feels like for me right now, in some cases, is I'm just looking at these tracks. I'm just witnessing the tracks, and the tracks are really painful for whatever reason, right? Like I don't know how tracks could be painful, but like they feel painful. But what I'm not doing in meditation is I'm not creating a new set of tracks to go somewhere else. And that's what it feels like the difference is with neuroplasticity is playing an active role, where meditation is much more of a witnessing role. Neuroplasticity is much more of an active role in creating the new path that you want ahead. Did I hit that right?
Yeah, exactly. And your experience is incredibly common with anyone who's feeling themselves in an agitated state or ongoing anxiety, certainly with illness. I'd say every person that comes through the door at Reorigin finds that meditation, at least in the beginning, if they start with that, can actually exacerbate their symptoms because they're just left tuning more deeply into them, right? And the key difference, what I like to explain, is that meditation is really great at calming the stress response if you have gotten into the practice. Neuroplasticity, on the other hand, is aimed at preventing the arousal of the stress response in the first place. And it does that in the ways that we just described by forming new associations between things. So if you haven't formed those new associations, then maybe you're trying to go into meditate and you hear a noise or a buzz, or you feel a symptom or a discomfort from your body. Now, a region of the brain, part of the limbic system, which is called the insula, responsible for interoception or taking signals from inside the body, will zoom in on that, and in some cases will amplify that because it's like, oh, now I'm quieting down. I'm just left to sit here with my own discomfort, with my own pain, with my own little annoyances. And so I think there's absolutely benefits and absolutely a time and a place for meditation. But there's also, I've found, a certain syntax, that's to say sort of priority of like, when do you pull this tool from the toolkit? And what we found typically is that first and foremost, it's important to shift gears, to change those new tracks. And when you can start to do that and overwrite the old tracks so that the nervous system and the limbic system are not so trigger happy, now is a place where you can bring in meditation and get deeper into those states of directing your awareness to positive sensations, which are always present, but they just get sometimes overcrowded by the negative ones.
Ben, if we use meditation to bring awareness to something, and the meditation is the practice, right? It's the thing that we do in order to bring awareness. Let's talk tactics here. What is the tactic that we're doing to increase our neuroplasticity or just create the new track? What are we doing?
Yeah, great question. So I would say if you're just using, say, meditation, as we've described it, to increase your awareness, oftentimes meditation will lead you, or your mind will lead you, really your brain will lead you to those things that it thinks it needs to protect you from. So this is why, negative symptoms and sensations can actually increase. The way we would use something in the way of mindfulness or meditation in neuroplasticity is to disidentify from the thing that's causing the agitation. So we acknowledge it. We don't want to ignore it. That's a subtle but important difference. Let's say, common example in meditation, you're sitting for a long time, you have a pain in the knee. For people that aren't struggling with limbic dysfunction or anxiety, they might be able to do this already. But for, I'd say, the vast majority of people that I work with, that pain in the knee is going to increase the more they meditate, because it's sort of like, don't think of pink elephants, right? What you resist persists. So, how I would put like the neuroplasticity spin on meditation for something like this is, when you notice a sensation or a thought or an emotion or any type of feeling in your body that I like to say is anything less than pleasant, start to see it for what it is. Realize that, first of all, acknowledge that it's there, but see if you can see yourself a little bit apart from it. You can use things like visualization to kind of like disidentify or give yourself distance from it. I like to personally shrink it down to like a little Post-it note size and stick it on the wall so it's out there. Not to say it's not happening, it's still there, but it's just the same way we have peripheral vision, we also have a periphery of experience. We have something called two-pointed awareness that we're capable of, where we can maintain contact with an unpleasant sensation or undesired thought or emotion or feeling. Well, at the same time, now here's the key, shifting the bulk of our awareness onto something that gives us a more pleasant feeling. Mm-hmm. And one of the easiest ways to do this, I've found, is to use our senses, because it's so visceral. So I like to say, lose your mind and come to your senses. So let's say, you have that pain in your knee. It's not really taking up your full bandwidth anymore. It's just there. Now, can you shift your awareness to some other maybe region of your body that feels good? Or even directing, like, looking at something that looks interesting. Right now I have looking out a window, I see green grass and a lot of greenery. It looks nice, even touching something with an interesting tactile sensation. I don't know if I have it here. I keep all these little interesting objects on my desk that have different weights and feelings. And what we're doing is we are reclaiming ownership of where our attention goes. And the neuroscience shows that the more you focus on something, the more your brain will take signals from that area, and the more neuronal real estate that we'll eventually have. So we are literally, by practicing this repeatedly, shrinking the amount of neuronal real estate that's been granted to unpleasant feelings or sensations or symptoms. And we are freeing up and giving more of that real estate back to things that are more advantageous for feeling good, feeling calm, feeling at ease. And this is done through, a very conscious but relatively simple practice.
So Ben, we got a few minutes left in this recording. And one of the things I know is going to be of the utmost importance to our listeners is this experience of constantly feeling this need to be in the state of busyness, this thing I call lazy busy, just indiscriminate action, because there's this fear of, if I stop or if I slow down or if there's free time, then I feel guilty, or something, life is passing me by. And at the same time, there is a deeper sense of knowing that anxiety and fear is really running their lives. And we've gotten so used to it that it's kind of like, I don't even know where to begin to break free from that pattern. But you've already given us a number of clues, right, as to what's going on here. So if you could talk to someone who's sitting in front of you right now that, like, they say, this is my life. I'm just start to finish. When I jump out of bed, I'm into my emails. I'm crushing things all day long, and I'm exhausted every night, but I can't get off that hamster wheel. What's the first place you would tell that person to start?
I think the starting point is awareness and understanding that we've been sold a bill of goods in this day and age. We live in a society that's incredibly exertion focused, and we have this, sayings. We talk about things like peak performance. I call this the myth of peak performance, because if everything is at peak, then there's actually no such thing as a peak, right? A peak is only a peak if it's predicated by a valley. I'm a skateboarder, so I'll give a visual example here. A skateboarder on a half pipe, this kind of U-shaped ramp, the only reason that they're able to launch into the air, that would be like the peak of the performance, the exciting part, is because they've first gone into the valley. And in fact, the deeper that they go in the valley, the more they bend their knees and get into that groove, the more inertia they build up to launch off the ramp. Now, our society just focuses on the launch, on the peak part, and says that's where we need to be at all times. So I think the number one thing is to understand that It's impossible. We're not designed to function that way. Really, what drives our physiology is oscillation. It's going back and forth between, these peaks and valleys, having periods of exertion followed by periods of rest and recovery. I know that people know this intellectually, and I know that there's a lot out there on rest and recovery and sleep in these days and everything. So intellectually, we get this, but we don't necessarily practice.
We don't do it.
Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second is once we understand that, we can kind of acknowledge and be okay with the fact, and it is a fact, that there is this oscillatory movement. There is this swing of the pendulum. We have days where we have energy. We have days where we have less energy. Rather than trying to use force to stop the pendulum from swinging back in the other direction, we have another option. We can climb the string of that pendulum. And this means sort of transcend it. And we'll talk about how we can do this in a moment. But imagine that you climb the string of that pendulum and allow the fluctuations to occur beneath you. So you are not emotionally invested or emotionally attached to being on or to being off. You're not for one and against the other. You are just doing what needs to be done with the ebb and flow. I'm a surfer. The tides do this. Everything in nature does this. We do this physiologically, but for some reason, we think we can outsmart it and override it. And it's that attempt to override that drives us into the ground. I would say for many people that are experiencing this and feeling like they're headed toward overwhelm or burnout or resistance, number one thing is to take a breath, relax, realize that these are natural functions. And then the other thing I would say is to kind of come back to your larger picture and focus on just the steps that we're taking. I think this is such a, maybe oversimplified, but such a potent way to approach this. The saying again is to lose your mind and come to your senses, to stop thinking about what we think we should be doing or need to be doing, and to really focus on the sensory experience in the moment of what we're doing. I've been through this cycle so many times, guys, of, overwhelm and burnout and getting to that point where I just can't go anymore. And then it reverts back into forced recovery, where now you've got to take weeks or whatever to recover. And then you feel like you've lost all this time. You got to make up for it. And the cycle starts again. The break out of this is literally getting back into your senses. And I mean that in the most literal way. Anyone can try this now. When they go to work the next time, when you're sitting at your computer, your keyboard, whatever it might be, really feel how enjoyable it can be to type on the keyboard. I even think of this when I reply to emails. I don't think of like, I'm getting through these emails. I think of, I'm doing brain retraining. I'm doing brain exercises by practicing my typing. You focus on the nuances of the physical experiences themselves. There is nothing else on this planet like that to get you into a flow state, which is defined as the state of optimal performance, the state at which we feel our best and perform our best. And the best part is it taps into a renewable source of energy, because we're not using the mechanism of exertion, which is the pathway of cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine. This is a very finite pathway. Instead, we're using the pathway of flow, of enjoyment. And this is the pathway of dopamine, driven by dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And these neurochemicals are expansive, meaning that we have an abundant supply of them. And that the more we work in this way, the more energy we actually get from it. Instead of the more we grind the gears with cortisol and adrenaline, the more we're depleting ourselves. So there's a good amount to get into here, but I just want to hope that kind of sums it up or paints the picture in a way that can start to transform how we engage with the work we do on a daily basis.
Ben, not only did we get great visuals today, I mean, we've got beaches and paths, we've got pendulums, we've got, what was the skateboarder, the half pipe?
The skateboard pipe.
Yeah. So we got some great visuals today, man. But I think the biggest thing I'm taking away from this is that in every moment of every day, like, we can bring awareness, right? Lose our mind and get into our senses to feel like the goodness. And for me, I know next time that I'm stressed out or I feel like I'm not moving at a pace that I'd love to move at, I'm going to take a pause and try to bring some awareness to what's actually going on in each day or in each moment. This has been a huge, huge help. I'm looking forward to making some of those new beach paths.
Yeah. And to bring it back to the quote where we started, the no man is free who is not master of himself. And you cannot be a master of yourself unless you have mastery over your brain and mind. This conversation has been super helpful. So Ben, with Reorigin, why don't you share with our listeners, anyone who is interested in doing one of your training programs? I know the program that I'm going through is specifically for folks who want to rewire their brain and reclaim their health. Is there anything else coming down the path?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, it's, brain retraining program. Primarily for the first program that we have out right now is for people using this to retrain the brain, the nervous system, the immune system to recover from chronic conditions. We do have a good number of recovering perfectionists and high performers, in the group. And so we are going to be releasing what's called U 2.0 version of this, which is much more oriented towards sustainable high performance and using these same sort of principles of self-directed neuroplasticity to being able to show up in the ways that we want, perform at high levels, but do it in a way that is sustainable, fun, and ultimately even replenishing.
So that would be a totally separate vertical, right? The vertical I'm a part of is really for like those who are reclaiming their health. And then this other one is for sustained high performance.
Yeah. First, we got to get back to baseline. Then we get to go above it.
That program is not yet out, is it?
Correct. Yeah, that will come in the new year.
In the new year. Cool. So I'm going to link it in the show notes. That way, for anyone who wants to follow along, they can stay connected. I'm going to link you. Is there an Instagram or anything else that you would want people to stay connected with you on?
Yeah, sure. Best way is actually the main website is just reorigin.com. That's re-origin.com. And they'll find some free resources there, self-assessments they can take. And our Instagram is at reorigin_official.
Hey, I want to take a minute to thank you guys for doing such an awesome job giving us those 5-star ratings on Spotify for the podcast. If you haven't had a chance to do so, it'll take you 2 seconds. Just go to the main Great Man Within podcast page, give us a 5-star rating. We appreciate it.